Hi, good evening, and welcome to our first Great Talk. I'm Eve Vogelstein, president of the Great Talk. On behalf of our board and our partners, we'd like to thank you for now being part of a new Maryland conversation for the joy of talking, even with people you may not agree with. This program was created by our executive director, Claudine Davison, who had this vision and made it come to fruition. Our board members, leaders in their own field, Diane Lee Davison, Greg Landry, and our partners, eminent Maryland institutions from MICA to Friends School, the Chesapeake Arts Center, Blue Rock Productions and Studio, to Loyola University, the Maryland Science Center, Maryland State University, and Maryland Public Television, and more. You deserve our most sincere thanks and profound appreciation. I would like to acknowledge the Zath McKinney Group at Morgan Stanley for their financial support, and the Mid-Atlantic Media and Strategic Factory for their printing and media support. Special thanks to WYPR for their wonderful interview this past Thursday. And you can hear the interview with Thomas Drake on their website. And as you know, tonight is our inaugural Great Talk panel conversation. And I hope that you'll continue sharing, ideas together for our Great Talk on January 9th at MPT, with another superb panel to discuss We the People, a Crisis of Identity. And on March 20th, please join us at Friends School for another forward-thinking topic, Star Trek Technology, Innovations and Ideas for Real. A lot more to question and to learn on April 24th for Truths, Myths, and Breakthroughs in Medical and Cancer Research at the Maryland Science Center. And the last talk of the season will bring you to the world of music at Morgan State University on June 5th to hear all about intro music, the lines, the heat, the business. And all the speaker details are listed in your program. Please prepare your questions and save them for our Q&A period after the panel discussion. Everyone is invited to meet and greet at the atrium following the Q&A. I also would please ask you to silence your cell phones so they don't disturb our program. And this is the moment at last to extend special thanks to MICA for being our host this evening, to Furman Deborah Bander, whose expertise is deeply appreciated, and to MICA's president, Samuel Hoy. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce President Hoy, who will introduce the members and the moderator of the panel. Thank you so much, and enjoy the Great Talk.
Thank you, Ava, and good evening again, everyone. I'm Samuel Hoy, president of MICA. It is my great pleasure to be here briefly, and I promise briefly, to provide a quick but really warm welcome to all of you. MICA is excited to host the inaugural panel of the inaugural season of a Great Talk series, which promises to be a wonderful addition to the city. It's really a series of conversations with a purpose, as they say, but also I'm just so glad to hear that it's also about bridging differences and talking across the aisles, which is so important for our country nowadays. For this evening, the series organizers have put together a great panel of expert speakers who will tackle the timely and crucial topic of cyber wars, the secrets to spies. Very intriguing. And our esteemed panelists include Thomas Drake, former National Security Agency senior executive and whistleblower; Richard Forno, director of University of Maryland, Baltimore County's Center for Cybersecurity; and Michael Hicks, professor of computer science at the University of Maryland and former director of the Maryland Cybersecurity Center. And we are very fortunate to have Dana Priest from the Washington Post here to moderate the panel. This will be a thought-provoking panel aiming to stimulate actually further conversations among yourselves and also with our panelists after the lecture. And without further ado, let's begin, and let me depart the stage with my warmest wishes to the Great Talk Series for most brilliant future. Please.
Okay, thank you. I drove up from Washington during rush hour, and I want you to know that I've now seen every MICA building around here, and there are at least a half a dozen that have MICA on their names, and now I know all the security guards, but I ended up in the nicest, coolest one. So, well, I thought instead of bridging differences, we were going to bridge like cybersecurity and art. You know, here's a College of Art that is sponsoring a talk on cybersecurity, which is curious and interesting. So a rumor was circulating that there are some art students in the audience. Are there any art students in the audience? Okay, good. So we're going to really look to you for some off-the-wall and really insightful questions in the end. First of all, I wanted to just start by having everyone do kind of a lay of the land, because you know, this last year we've talked a lot about the internet and social media and foreign hostile forces penetrating social media and hacking, and maybe hacking, tweaking our election. So we're all supposed to be getting better at this, since it's not new anymore. Are we getting better at the security of our systems? And if so, why? And if not, why? Why don't we start here with Dick Forno?
Yeah. Part of me says, yes, we are getting better at things, but by and large, we have a long way to go, and I think in some ways, the same recommendations on what we need to do in terms of securing our systems and our data, if not now our society, are the same recommendations that many of us have made over the past 10 or 20 or 30 years. Basic computer security practices, in many cases, still aren't being followed. One of the big things to make news these days are data breaches, when your credit card information or your medical records get stolen. And we've had a lot of high-profile cases, Target, Home Depot, the Office of Personnel Management, of which I'm a victim of that, the Veterans Administration. The problem is, a lot of this data was never secured properly to begin with, and in some cases, not secured at all. Why in 2017 do we still leave a laptop containing unencrypted data, personal information of thousands of people, in a car or at a coffee shop? There's no excuse for that. So yes, there's a long way to go, but we have to start by not continuing to fail basic computer security 101.
So, Mike, I wanted to ask you specifically about the Democratic National Committee hack, which was not really a hack. You know, most people think of a hack as some hacker sitting somewhere, you know, punching a computer and figuring out how to enter the computer system of something they don't own. But the DNC hack was so much simpler than that. Can you explain I believe, a phishing with the PH, who knows why? If you can explain that, that'd be good too. And then, is that something that individuals suffer as much from as big organizations?
So there's a lot to unpack there. So, I mean, if you think back to before the internet age, there were always scams, right? So there were always people pretending to be somebody else to try to part you from your wallet. And they came to your door and told you they were going to sell you this amazing product, and you believed them, and because they did such a great demonstration, and so then you wrote them a check, and then you never saw the product. And what happened with the internet is they were just able to scale up this operation to an incredible degree by sending email, right? So all of us have received spam email, and fortunately for most of us, these fake emails are really easy to spot, right? They're from some prince in Nigeria somewhere who's trying to desperately get $3 million out of some bank account, and if only you will provide your bank account, will this person be able to get the money out of their bank account. So most of us quickly learned to notice all of the spelling mistakes and weird punctuation and so on in these emails, and eventually computers became able to identify them as well and send them into our spam folder. And I would say spam is largely a solved problem after decades of trying. But there is still a certain sort of spam that manages to get past those filters, which is the same sort of scam that's always been there, which is to convince you to tell someone who doesn't have your best interests at heart to give them information that they can use against you. So a so-called phishing attack is phishing. I'm seeing if I can hook you to get you to tell me something that I can use against you. And maybe that information could be a password to one of your accounts. Maybe it could be some personal information that I can use to learn what your password might be by guessing it more effectively. And that's because, when you answer those questions, they, especially so-called spear phishing attacks, which are designed not for arbitrary consumption, where you send it to 1 million people and hope that 3 take the bait. They're designed specifically for specific people, knowing something about those people's lives, who their friends are, things that you can find publicly, and masquerade as those people. Those attacks can be quite convincing and can part you from this information and eventually, steal quite a lot. So you mentioned the DNC hack this was the starting point for that, was a phishing attack for someone in the campaign. But this happens to everybody. I mean, especially, for example, CEOs of big companies will be known to get an email from what looks like a trusted confidant that has an attachment in it, and they install the attachment, and it puts software on their machine that steals their information. And, it only takes one mistake for you to get into big trouble. You can ignore these emails 100 times, but on that 101st time when you install that, boom, that's it. So it's very challenging to get security right when one small mistake can lead to a catastrophic failure. It's not like there's a little crack in your building and a little crack is fine. You need 1,000 cracks before the building falls down. With software and computer systems, one tiny little crack is enough to knock the whole thing over. So it's a very challenging world we live in.
And Tom, you've worked behind the curtain in the government, in the big government with lots of tools, lots of money, National Security Agency nearby. What have we learned about the people who are hackers in the last 10 years? Why? So the DNC hack supposedly was done by the Russians. We think we have a good idea of why that happened. Because the intelligence community has given us an assessment. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But can you talk about non-government hackers? What do we know about why they're doing what they're doing and spending so much time in it? And what's the PH thing about phishing? Why is it spelled PHISHING?
Yeah, that gets into sort of the urban legend, but also just that environment, the cyber environment. Cyberpunk environment.
The cyberpunk
Yeah,
environment?
just the spelling, it's designed, it's give it a uniqueness, and so you use sort of the phonetic letters, right, that actually more closely match than the actual dictionary letters in terms of the sounds, and it makes it cooler. Why the non-state actors have become a significant factor in terms of threats, in terms of hacking, and I put hacking in quotes because hacking takes many guises, right?
Could you give us kind of like a profile of a hacker who's not a state actor?
Well, it's not necessarily what the president of the United States said during the campaign that some 400-pound person, right, was. Yeah, it's a bit of a myth there, in living in the basement, right? Okay, with pizza, being shoved down the chute of the door. But technology has made it much more accessible in terms of living on the net. There's also the extraordinary ability to remain largely anonymous, or through various guises. And information, why are there these actors or even non-state actors out there? Information and data carries a lot of value. And think about what happened with OPM not too long ago.
That's the Office of Personnel Management that manages.
How many received a letter in the mail saying that, anybody raise your hands out in the audience? You know, it is a little unnerving, given where I used to work for a number of years, a little unnerving, not just to find out how insecure the data was, and data in many cases, in the case of my own situation, that was not in digital form in the past. It was actually largely paper-based records that became digitized or went digital. And you're getting this letter that's saying just about anything there is to know about you has been compromised, up to and including your Social Security number. And then you're offered the option to have your credit monitored, right? It's like, well, do I actually trust the service that they're monitoring me? Because I have to provide certain information in order for them to monitor, right? Which in itself, and we may talk about this, there's these, we sort of obfuscate ourselves in the cyber. You put cyber in front of something, by the way, that makes it sexy. So just be careful what you put cyber in front of. Somehow if it's cyber, then it's like, oh yeah, that's like, ooh, better listen here, right? Or it's like that, it's just the word cyber. Just language gets very overloaded here in this realm. But information is power. And if I have data about people, there are brokers out there who are more than willing to take it and use it for various means. Now, it could also be used for identifying people in the government for possible compromise for later. But this is extraordinary amounts of data. We're talking millions upon millions upon millions upon millions of records. And having done software engineering and system engineering in one of my career choices in the past, particularly when it worked as a technical director for several years at the National Security Agency, if you don't build in security, if you don't build it in by design, then guess what? It's an insecure design. And so you can't like bolt it on later. Because software doesn't tend to like things getting bolted on. You actually make it even more complex. And you'll hear this phrase, this other phrase called you increase your attack surfaces. You expose yourself even more to a non-state actor, for example. So, and these non-state actors could be proxies. They could be operating their own. They could be funded or sponsored by nation-state actors. But just hard to say. So these mysterious groups out there, and they go by various, and strange names, or they call themselves their names, or they're assigned names. So this is what I've called sort of the golden age, right, of cyber surveillance. It's just an extraordinary, challenging environment. And the thing about data is, how do you protect it? This is a core question that you started to answer earlier, is what does it mean to protect the data that actually has value? It's one thing to share things on social media, right? I work with a lot of millennials each and every day, right? But they choose to share what they share, and some of us, there may be older generation are a little, like, wow, I wouldn't be sharing that. But that's the age in which we live. But we're talking about data that actually goes even deeper than that. But the problem is, in terms of, I know we're going to circle back here, but the social engineering aspect of this, it makes it very easy, once you know enough about somebody, whether it's just a broad phishing attack or something that's more directed, like a spear phishing attack, where you're targeted, not just a general attack. I've received these types of emails. I'm sure a number of us have. And I remember there was a period, this is my one example I'll share, where I would start getting these emails from LinkedIn. At one time, I did have a LinkedIn account. But then I realized I would follow up before I'd answer it, because these are the kind of attacks you have to log into LinkedIn. But are you actually logging into LinkedIn? Given my background, I could quickly identify the fact that the link was not a LinkedIn IP address, the internet protocol. It was not. It was a different address. And guess what I would give up? The core credentials that identify me. So who are you on internet? It's an interesting question. How do you authenticate? It's a different world that we're in, and yet it's also an extraordinarily open world. There's people I have met and had conversations with I never would have had otherwise, right? So it's sort of the best and the worst of times, as they sometimes say in literature.
So Mike, I know that you have a solution, the software solution to some of the insecurity that we're talking about in all these systems. Can you talk about that? You gave me a great analogy over the phone when we talked.
Actually, I think Tom said it very well, which is building security in. So if you think today about the way we build buildings, we develop engineering principles that we have seen over time actually work, and we have codes that people have to follow and adhere to these rules and principles. And when they do, it's very likely that the building will, in fact, hold up to what it was designed to hold up to. And if they don't build it according to those principles and codes, then they can be held responsible for that. So, if the bridge falls down, if the building falls down, then the people who build it are responsible for that. In software, we really don't have that. So most of the things that we use to interact with over the internet, we sign licenses for, right? So that irritating license that you click through, that's your giving up liability. It's an interesting thing. If there's software inside of your toaster, and your toaster, due to a software error, blows up your house, you can sue the toaster manufacturer for that. But if your word processor has a vulnerability in it due to a software error that's exploited, and some malicious malware ends up on your machine and encrypts all of your files, that's too bad. You shouldn't have clicked the license agreement.
Why does that big loophole exist?
It's a matter of the way consumer protection laws were formulated. So they were formulated around things that had a purported purpose. And software, this was a sort of a clever thing that software manufacturers came up with, that you don't buy software, you license it. And because you license it, you can license it as is and give away any warranty that you might otherwise
Is anyone
expect.
trying to fix that? It sounds like a
There's no
government
way
regulation
that the
thing.
software companies want that changed, right? They really like not having to have this sort of this liability. So it's going to get outside of my comfort zone to talk too much about. This is a policy question, right? Why is it that something that we could do we're not doing? I mean, I could speculate about business interests and having Congress's ear and having incentives to leave things the way they are. I presume that's part of the explanation. But I would say the bigger thing that's relevant to all of us is that we don't know perfectly how to design software that's impregnable to attack, but we have a lot better idea of how to do it than we actually do it today, because there is so little incentive to get it right. I think the interesting thing is, so another analogy, we would not imagine that you would just build a building using, plywood and tin and shoddy methods, and then when it started to fall down a little bit, the right solution would be to come along and put a little duct tape over that spot and say, oh, no, now it's a fine building. And then that part falls down, and then we put a little more duct tape and epoxy over that part, and then this other part falls down. But this is what happens with software, right? We don't step back and say, look, by the time I get to the end of this, it will withstand this attack or this attack or this attack. Instead, we say, I want to get this product to market, and I'm pretty sure people will buy it. And if something goes wrong, it's okay, I'll patch it later, or maybe nothing bad will happen. And that's a very difficult reality to live in. I mean, what you said before, we're making these same mistakes over and over again. Frankly, I think we lack the incentive. The landscape lacks the incentives to fix these mistakes, and I think we'll just keep on making them until the incentives are fixed.
Rick, do you have a policy interpretation of that, do you think?
Yeah, I think Mike hit the nail on the head, and the question certainly is relevant, that we need to address the software and the technology. But a lot of the problems in cybersecurity and cyber warfare and the whole cyber domain aren't necessarily exclusively limited to technology. I tell people there are three components to any of these devices and technologies we use. Hardware, your phone, your tablet, your computer, your car, your toaster, your smart toothbrush, whatever. Software, the data, the stuff that makes these things work and allows us to communicate and exchange and have fun and share cat pictures. And then the wetware. And the wetware is the most complicated computer system in the world, but it's also the easiest one to exploit. And I'm referring here to the human brain. And this ties into what Mike said about spear phishing and how easy it is to trick somebody. Tricking people is not a new thing of the cyber age. Blackmail and extortion, creating fear and uncertainty and distrust, that goes back millennia. So that's not new. But it's more than just a technical fix. We as a society, as users, as governments and politicians, need to look at technology, how we use it, and how we embrace it. And we rush to embrace the conveniences of all these things. The smart house. Who's got a Google Home or an Amazon Echo at home?
One, two.
A few people here. The smart home. So basically, you've got an always-on microphone in your living room or bedroom that can be tapped by any number of bad people. Okay?
Just FYI.
Yeah. Sleep well tonight. But what I'm getting at is that
Don't talk in your sleep.
these are really cool
Yes,
toys and
right.
tools. And social media, Facebook, all these, it's great that we take advantage of these things. But we rush to embrace them eyes wide open because they're cool and awesome and fun. But then not many people stop and say, wait a minute, what am I giving up? My data, my privacy, letting some third party develop my network of contacts on social media, letting a Google or an Amazon listen in to my house, everything that goes on in range of this microphone. And that's the other side of the equation. Fixing the technical problems is important, but also fixing the human factors, the human problems, asking the important questions of why or why not are equally important, and how we use these technologies and why we put up with things like software licensing and these sort of annoyances that indemnify the companies for creating problems. That's something we have to address, and that's not a technical solution. That requires a policy and more so a cultural and social change. And that's something that's not easy to do, and we just have to keep banging the table to try to raise awareness of the other side of the coin. That's not just technology, that it's a much broader discussion.
Well, since you brought up culture, let's talk about social media for a minute. Over the last year, you've heard a lot about social media being used by the Russians, being used by other various political actors. Both campaigns had very sophisticated social media, micro-targeting. They know a lot about you, and they know what you might respond to, and they used it. Actually, it goes back to at least Obama's campaign, very, very good on that. So first of all, I want to ask you, because you've already told me the answer, are you on social media? Are you on Facebook, Twitter, and the like? And what do you think about those for yourself?
Okay. I'm a security person. I've been in the security space for 20 years. Yes, I am on social media. Good luck trying to find me. I am not on Facebook. I'll give you a hint. I use technology, whatever it is, on my terms. And just because it's cool, I didn't want to jump on and suddenly be part of the Facebook constellation and then seeing how it could track me if I went to the Washington Post or the New York Times. It could track my mouse clicks around the internet. That didn't sit well with me. I got sick of having to change my privacy settings or at the idea of having to change my privacy settings every time Facebook changed their policies. All right, to me, it was wasted effort. So yes, I do tweet semi-anonymously.
What does that mean?
That means semi-anonymous. It's not my real name. It's a nickname. People bump into me at conferences. They know who my Twitter handle is. That's great. But it's not posted publicly as Rick Forno. And that's okay. I'm comfortable with that. It's a choice I made that, yes, does create problems now and then because you feel excluded from your social circle where they're sharing the cat pictures and the wedding pictures and whatnot. But people understand, and it's not as bad of a stigma as it was 5 years ago, but as we see more and more of things get networked and connected, and there's this cross-pollination of user tracking and surveillance and authentication across platforms, that's concerning to me. So yes, I watch my social media use very carefully, my internet use carefully, and I look at people who use Facebook and they say, we're going on family vacation, we're gonna be out of town for 3 weeks, we're going to Hawaii, wonderful. They come home, their house has been burglarized, their jewelries are stolen. They file the claim with the insurance company says, did you talk about it online? Yes, we mentioned it on Facebook. They're not processing the claim because it was your own fault for being stupid and telling the world that you were gonna be out of town. So again, it comes back to how we use the technology. And we shouldn't be so willing to just rush it, my view, we shouldn't be so willing to just rush it and use it as we're expected to use it. Think before you click is really, it's an old adage, but it really applies even today.
Tom, what about you? Are you on social media?
I am. I primarily use Twitter.
And how's that worked out?
Well, it's a very public profile, probably because I became a very public figure. So I'm not semi-anonymous or anonymous. Do I do other kinds of communication in which you would not know it's me? Yes, but that's private communication. So my Twitter account is the primary means by which I have a social media presence. I don't do Facebook
Why not?
because I just know too much about Facebook.
Okay, we'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah. And I don't do any of the other platforms either. I'm certainly aware of them. I certainly work with a generation that uses a lot of those apps. But just interestingly enough, just to show you sort of the dark side of this, and this just came out in the last couple of days, it was a reporter who discovered this and then reported on it after doing an investigation. There is a rather popular keyboarding app on the Android platform. And guess what it was doing without your knowledge
What?
or consent? Capturing just about every keystroke you ever made.
If you have the Android phone?
And you're using this particular keyboarding app. So it's hooked in, they call it API, Application Program Interface. It's hooked in to the Android operating system. And guess what you were sharing? It didn't matter if you were communicating privately, it was being recorded. There was a script behind the scenes that was then pulling it into a database. Well, it turns out a rather enterprising individual discovered this database that had no protection at all, meaning it's like you go up to a house or a car and it's not locked. I mean, that's like the first level, right? No protection at all. No password at all. So just walked right in, and we're talking umpteen millions of records. And we're not just talking a couple of keystrokes assigned to a person. We're talking about profiling information of a pretty significant nature. I was just reading about this yesterday, and it's like, wow, here we go again.
What do you mean by that? Here we go again.
Because what will they do with that data? The claim was made, it turns out, that no, they would not normally record, right? Well, gee, without your knowledge, because we have this secret script that just pulls it every time you touch the keyboard, that particular app. We send all that information and we store it in a database. The kicker, the way it was discovered, is because the database had no password at all. It was wide open, as long as and there are those out there looking. I mean, look at the Amazon breach recently, where some extraordinarily sensitive information. I'm sure those in the national security arena, including you gentlemen, would be rather concerned that some of that information was just out there, right, in a cloud that just sort of got posted without any protection to speak of, or minimal protection, and you could access it. I mean, this is the part what we're confronting with. The amount, I mean, I saw the rapid transition from the analog era of the information age, which existed well before Marconi, right, to the digital age. And information was precious. It was scarce to gain access to it. You couldn't collect it all. You just didn't have the capacity or the technology. Now it's trivial. It's trivial. And we're just like, everything has gone digital.
Yep.
The thing, I just want to circle back. This human factor is huge. I can't overemphasize the weak link in all of this. But the software industry itself, and I was actually part of a number of studies. This goes back to what I call the go-go 90s, when internet really became public. And people were, because technology had leveled the playing field, and if a nondescript industrial park out in south of San Francisco, near Cupertino, I could have a computer, an Ethernet connection, and a phone, and guess what? I could develop the next killer app. Who cared about security? And so what developed was this total lack of responsibility and a total lack of any liability. So when you actually do click those terms and conditions, my lawyer friends, and I've had a number of lawyers in my life, that's a contract of adhesion. You are literally signing away any liability. it literally is as is, no matter what its condition is, it's in an as is state. And so, hey, if you get breached, if you lose it, if something crashes, if your computer disappears in terms of what's on it, hey, it's your fault. If you're ransomware because, you were quote unquote too stupid to know better, hey, don't blame the software. That was your fault. So the human factor is actually becoming even more of a factor in all of this. And we often overlook that factor and we tend to not want to deal with it.
Well, and we love social media because it connects us to people we want to be connected to. And so we're willing to share so much on that without maybe thinking it completely through. Do you think, Mike, that Facebook is sort of an intelligence operation? Given what it knows about individuals, it is collecting a huge amount of information on each of us.
I mean, Facebook's value is its information, right? You wouldn't get on Facebook if all the people you wanted to connect with weren't also on Facebook, right? What point is that? But the problem is that you might think of the connections you're making as being directly with your friends, but they're not. They're going through this third party, which is Facebook. So they're collecting, storing, analyzing, monetizing all of that information. It's very interesting. Facebook has... you can buy ads on Facebook, right? So this is apparently what the Russian hackers did, was they created fake accounts that made them look like Americans and bought ads, and these were so-called targeted ads. And how targeted ads work are that you are able to specify in your ad contract, please show my ad to people that satisfy this, and this criteria. So I can say, I want you to only show it to people in Baltimore, Maryland, who are between the ages of 25 and 35, who recently made this kind of purchase. It's very, very fine-grained. You can explore the information that Facebook knows about everybody through the ad interface. So if you have a technologically savvy friend, you can sample what information they will give you. You don't have to buy an account. You can just get access to the ad account. And it is shocking how fine-grained they can target. And so this is what makes the ads on the Facebook platform so powerful to businesses, interests, whatever, because they can really nail a demographic, right? So imagine marketing, for those of you who watched the Mad Men TV show, right, did all this marketing, they had to come up with things that they thought reached a lot of people, and they hoped that it worked. But they didn't get that much feedback other than people either bought the product or they didn't. Now, there's so much more information available through these social media platforms that makes it very lucrative. I mean, this is why Google and Facebook and so on make so much money, because they have so much information about us that makes the ads that they show that much more valuable. So to answer your question, yes, absolutely. Facebook is a surveillance organization. They are surveilling us, and they're getting all of this information so they can make money. Because, every once in a while we see an ad that we like. We're more likely to click on that ad if it's something that's relevant to us. And Facebook makes it possible for people to zero very closely in on who we are and allow others to take advantage of that.
So, Tom, you work for a surveillance agency, and you know that it had laws and rules about, well, who it could collect on, what it could do with that. Sometimes it kind of went into a broad interpretation of that, as we know. Does Facebook have laws and rules about what it can do? Are they subject to any rules about what it can do with all the information it has on you?
Other than their own terms and conditions that you sign off on? No. They're not a governmental organization.
So you said a minute ago
They're not under the same, they're a commercial organization. They exist to generate a profit. They commoditize your social profile and your social identity.
So what do they do that is worrying to you? Because you said you're not on Facebook because you know what it can do.
It's because the staggering amount of information that's available to them. It's the persistence. You see, what's happening in the digital age, this other word, persistence, is it's essentially permanent information about you. It's not perishable. It just stays. And so you can actually build up an entire history of a person's presence, their digital footprint, as it were, and everything they leave behind over many, many years.
And minute to minute to minute. Persistence is both
We're not talking.
Duration
No, this
and-
is not aperiodic. Okay, to use a fancy word. This is every day, every minute, even down to the second. I mean, it's that precise.
And that's what worries you about them.
It worries me because when that amount of data, I mean, we're seeing, anybody see the Circle movie? Well, it got panned by some of the critics, Tom Hanks. There's some extraordinary statements that were made in there. I thought it was very contemporary in terms of what we face. But you saw the abuse of power, the abuse of the information that was available, where people were exploited because of vulnerabilities, things that were actually going on inside their family, and how they would manipulate people. This is extraordinary power. It's extraordinary power. And to have all this within one company. But I get the data is extraordinarily valuable, and they're exploiting, right? That's the human factor. They're exploiting this human need to feel connected. I mean, it's interesting that it's sort of this, as much as the digital age fragments us, we want to feel connected. So this is a way in which you get to sell back the very identity that gets fragmented that we hold in our massive databases. Now you can feel whole again. And more of an empty wallet for those that are buying their items. Because I mean, that's what's sort of the end state here. Where does this, what's the end state of this? I understand, companies, I mean, I gave a talk some years ago, and I know that you could have heard a pin drop because all the leading lights of the digital industry were present at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco. That was the fall of 2011. And I had someone come up to me later and said, yeah, you sort of punctured the balloon, right? No one wants to talk about the fact that we're commoditizing all of this and then selling it back to our subscribers. The legal part of this gets very interesting. What's called third-party doctrine. So the government on the other side, right, you talk about the surveillance, the golden age of surveillance. If you have a national security purpose, right, or an interest, you can go to a Facebook. You can go to a credit bureau. And under that cover, hey, third-party doctrine applies, right? Smith versus Maryland. There's no reasonable expectation of privacy that any of the information or data that is held by that business.
But you
is
need
yours.
a warrant. You need a warrant.
Well, depending on.
You need some kind of court oversight.
Yeah, it could be
court,
administrative. It could be a national security letter, right?
Yeah.
But it's the assumption that there's no reasonable expectation of privacy that sort of bypasses sort of the traditional checks that have existed. And this also gives the government enormous access to extraordinary amounts of data, and it's another arena that's ripe for abuse and has been abused.
So Rick, just to get into the cyber war a little bit, but on the same topic, could, with the right manipulation, could some of our adversaries like Russia, North Korea, I don't know, Iran, could they get some of this data and use it to their advantage against us?
Well,
The Chinese, I'll put in there too.
I think the answer is yes, and we're living through that right now. The Russians weaponized information against us in the 2016 elections. That's been pretty evident. The intelligence community has had assessments, both classified and unclassified, to that. And yeah, that's, I think, showed the power of what could happen. And what was interesting about 2016 is it was seeing the use of technology, social media, things like that, targeted advertising, data mining, data analytics, to weaponize information to target not necessarily computer systems, but to target people and the cultural, the consciousness of a society, to get us thinking a certain way, to kind of sow the seeds of division and create this polarized, help create this polarized society that we're living in now. So yeah, we're seeing this now. On the other side, I don't see a hacker necessarily launching a nuclear, the U.S. nuclear arsenal. In fact, the best news I heard
Well, that's good news.
the best news I heard
One piece of good
last
news.
year was a 60 Minutes story that was, it made news because there was a report about how America's intercontinental ICBM missile silos had old school 1970s era floppy disks controlling their systems. And I thought, this is awesome. There's no internet. Okay, that's great. it's a form of resiliency and security through obscurity and obsolescence. But it got me thinking about these sort of systems and, what's the likelihood? I mean, you mentioned that cyber in front of anything makes it more sensational, and it does. Cyberbullying, cyber warfare, cyber blackmail, cyber. Cyber war is real, but it's not necessarily going to be this gloom and doom scenario that Hollywood or certain politicians would want us to think. We have to approach it rationally.
Yep. So the difference between, you'd mentioned the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, which is the HR department for all federal employees, basically. The Chinese are believed to have hacked that, gotten millions of IDs and much more, blackmailable information, but they didn't release it. They didn't do anything with it. And Jim Clapper, the head of the Director of National Intelligence, said, well, congratulations to them. They're really good. He wouldn't say that about the Russians because they released it. They actually did something with it. So what constitutes in this, does stealing and not releasing constitute anything unusual? What might get into that cyber war or cyber aggression area?
Well, the one that comes to mind, and it's partly our own actions, is, because it is raised in certain conversation fora, but you're talking about the cyber war, and it's been used as an example. What does this mean in terms of the laws of war? Mm-hmm. And that's Stuxnet. There's other variations
Can
of that.
you describe what that is?
Well, Stuxnet was an extraordinary program. It had a classified name. It went under a certain program, and it effectively interfered with the centrifuge process of nuclear facilities in Iran. And some very interesting technology and some very interesting human factors at play were able to interfere in a way that caused them to sort of spin out of control, to say it simply.
And there's a great movie on it called 0 Days.
Yeah, and we're not the only, obviously, actors. And this is where you see sort of the reality of this, where it's not just virtual anymore, it has direct effects. So the concern is, what does it mean in this cyber landscape, to overuse the word cyber, but in this digital age, what does it mean to attack? And if you are attacked, does that cross some kind of threshold? Or is there a threshold? Or is this just, it takes place in between the zeros and ones, right? The bits and the bytes. And there's a lot of bytes out there. So what does that mean? What does it mean to a nation state, or nation state non-state actor, or even non-state actors interfering with other non-state actors or with other nation states or through proxies? Because a lot of this is taking place in the shadows. And it's a virtual world, and it's very obscure, and you don't know all the players involved. One of the challenges here is who do you know, how do you know who's who in this space? The authentication issue is so fundamental to identity, but what if your identity is obscured and you're not who you say you are? There's a famous cartoon, I brought this up and I haven't said this in a while, but this is an opportunity. There's a famous New Yorker cartoon, because New Yorker is known for their cartoons, but this goes back to the 90s. There's the old school CRT, cathode ray tube, sitting on a pizza box computer, old school pizza box computer. And it's on a table, and sitting at a chair on the table is a dog, and there's a little dog looking up on it. And the caption basically says, no one knows who you are on internet. And it's a fundamental question. So how do you know where an attack comes from? What if the attack in itself is masked? What if it's made to appear to come from somebody else? One of the biggest concerns I have, because we had this even in the analog era of the information age, I remember Able Archer. In 1983, we almost had an accidental nuclear exchange. So what does it mean in the virtual world if someone decides to even make it look like there's an attack, or they believe there's an attack? Does that then translate in terms of the real world? I mean, this is this extraordinary intersection of sort of the virtual world with the real world. But then how do you know what's real? So these are fundamental questions that are being wrestled with, but part of what's accelerating and keeping and staying out in front of all this is technology. Policy and law is having great difficulty keeping up in this space. And it's interesting because of my own background and public profile is, I'm now meeting lawyers, policy analysts who are now beginning to wrestle with this, and in some cases, there's even academic papers that are now being written about this. What is cyber law? Can you do a direct, in some cases you can't, can you direct a direct analog between the analog and the digital? It's not necessarily a one-to-one correspondence.
So before we turn it over to the audience, which we're going to do very shortly, one more question, and we've got microphones on either side, so if you want to think about your question, and go to one or the other side. My last question before that is, does it seem to you that the government was sort of slow in telling us about the Russian presence on social media? So we know about the hack of the DNC, but what about all this other stuff? And, we probably don't even know half of it, because it's the social media companies don't really want to tell us much about it. But what about the U.S. government, given all of its, it got doubled in size almost after 9/11, but they were sort of late in telling us that this was going on. Do you have some ideas about why that might be, Rick?
Well, I think the companies certainly had a vested interest in keeping quiet about much of this for obvious reasons, commercial interest, self-interest. But the government, the Obama administration, I do feel sorry for them in a way over this, because if they had gone public with some statements to say the Russians were involved and they're trying to influence public opinion for the elections, this, it would look to some parts of the country as if the White House was injecting politics and national security, politicizing national security to help one side win the election. On the other hand, if they kept quiet, which they pretty much did, we saw the results. So they were truly, the White House was in an unenviable position, and the statement that did come out from the Director of National Intelligence was only about, I think, 2 paragraphs or so, if that. And it was very, very bland. It took them several months to put this little thing together because it had to go through so many political review processes. So the government really was in a bind as to what to do. And as much as I may grumble about, what the outcome may or may not have been, I can't fault them because I can kind of sympathize with what they were grappling with politically at the time.
So they would have also, the intelligence world would have had to inform Congress if they had seen something as dramatic as we now know they did, because they need to tell them. So why didn't anybody in Congress? I mean, the government's a big organization. Mike, you want to try that? I mean, do you even agree with what I'm saying, or?
I don't know. I mean, this is not, I guess the one thing that came to mind while you guys were talking about it is that this attribution problem, this authentication problem, is a serious problem. That whether you're a state actor or a non-state actor, if you're good at your job of hacking into stuff and doing phishing attacks and so on, you can cover your tracks very well. It's very easy to hack into a series of systems and to leapfrog from this one to that one to this one to that one, and to use a signature that may appear as if it's somebody else's signature and so on. And so that, you mentioned the China hack of OPM some time ago. How do we know that it was them? It certainly did. The attacks did not come from China, so why do we think they're from China? Well, there's lots of other supporting information that is painstaking to put together, and not everyone agrees with it. I mean, the hack on Sony that I think eventually became attributed to North Korea, not everybody agrees that it was North Korea that did it. So, so I would just put that down as context for delay, that even within the intelligence community and within the broader security community, they're not smoking guns, that there is evidence and there's differences of opinion, and especially when it's in a highly politicized environment that 3 weeks from now we get some evidence that says you're totally wrong, not like that ever happened in the past. then you got egg on your face and you look terrible, and you have stuff called out at you for a long period of time. So I think it's a very tough problem.
Tom, what do you think?
I'm probably the greater cynic here, just given sort of dirty
Probably,
knowledge
yeah.
when it comes to this space. We sometimes forget our own history here. The Constitution, in the preamble, something I defended, took an oath to support and defend 4 times in my government career, does say that one of the primary responsibilities of government is to provide for the common defense. It doesn't say provide for the common offense. And in this post 9/11 world, there's been an extraordinary emphasis, and I say an undue emphasis on offense.
Yes.
If you unduly focus, almost myopically, on offense, especially in the cyberspace, it blinds you to those who may actually be on the offense against you. And so you tend to ignore, right? And I've actually asked the hard questions in certain fora. I says, well, my gosh, if these things are happening, where is? Now, I've had some of those in very, very senior levels, some currently in the administration, others who were previously in previous administrations. Well, we can't do that because of certain laws. But there is a fundamental responsibility if you're to provide for the common defense. You can't just say because it's cyber that somehow we're absolved of our own responsibility. Aren't you supposed to be detecting these nation state or non-state actors who may be interfering in our own affairs and isn't in the public interest? And if there are these vulnerabilities, exploitations, the CVEs, zero-day vulnerabilities, you just hold those because you want to keep things vulnerable because it makes it easier for your offensive operations. That means you're actually making us less secure. So, having been at an agency where there was a defensive side, although a much smaller part of NSA, it does raise some fundamental questions as to where do you place your emphasis. There are those in the sports, arena, would say that the best offense, right, is a good defense. You better start there because it doesn't matter how good your offense is if your defense is in shambles. Or you just take the arrogant position that we're so good it doesn't matter, right? Not in this space. In this space, it doesn't. The technology, and given the liability or the lack of liability, there are many vulnerabilities. And I understand why companies don't want to advertise. I don't understand why companies don't want to be known. I don't understand why companies would be reluctant to even share with the government, right, their own intellectual property, because that's sort of the crown jewels of their own company. And on the other hand, if there are those who are penetrating those companies and exploiting and extracting, who's providing? Yeah, and that's like a national level question in terms of the responsibilities of the government. But then you come back all the way to the local, everyday level. Where's the responsibility of the company? You're selling products, selling network services, infrastructure. We've seen too many of these where you're finding out that major companies had huge holes in the security of their products.
Were you going to say
Yeah,
something,
just
Tom?
to build on that point too, because you struck a nerve with me. Cyber is sexy right now, and it's been sexy for a good number of years. And the priority has been on offense. Cyber warfare, the offense. We've got all the cyber mission teams and hackers doing all this stuff on the government side. Defense is where it's needed. We are probably the most vulnerable nation on earth in terms of our cyber systems.
How can that be?
Because we've built this network on a flawed foundation that was never designed to do what it's doing, among other reasons. But computer security, cybersecurity, the day-to-day really is boring. You're securing systems. It's not glamorous. It's great paying. There's a lot of great jobs in this. We're training students to do this. But it's not sexy for the budget makers and the politicians who want to advertise what they're doing to show how strong in cyber we are. So I agree with your point. We need to ramp up the defense and really get down in the weeds and get dirty and be bored so that we don't open ourselves up to more vulnerabilities.
There's an extraordinary paradox when it comes to internet. Some people forget that the original internet was actually a government university consortium. And it was designed in case you had a nuclear winter. You could still get the message out, which meant you had to have an extraordinarily open system. And so the protocols, as they call them, underneath that were developed weren't designed with security in mind, like to keep the message. You wanted the message to get out. So we're really in this paradox in this cyber age.
And I've heard the developers of the original web say, we didn't even imagine bad actors would do bad things. Okay, so I really would love to hear from the audience, especially the art students, because I can't in my mind make the connection between cyber and art, but I really would like to.
Hello, my name is Jeanette I'm an exchange student from Sweden. Thank you for this interesting discussion. I have actually two questions. I can start with one and see if I'm still be here.
Okay.
Year 2006, U.S. Department of Justice became a party to the Convention on Cybercrime, together with several industry groups, like, for example, McAfee. My question is, has this treaty enforced in U.S. jurisdiction for cybercrime laws? If so, what has it resulted? If not, how so?
It was the night. Are you aware of that? The 2016 cybercrime treaty?
2006, the Convention on Cybercrime, the Council of Europe Cybercrime Convention was ratified, and the U.S. was a signatory to it. I think we actually helped write part of it. I don't know how enforceable it is domestically here. I don't know if there are any cases coming out of it. I haven't read it recently.
Either of you two? Anything to add?
I'm only familiar from it, given my own case. There is one of the criminal codes in Title 18, the U.S. Code, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, has been used by the U.S. government to go after hacktivists who have been alleged or accused or were found to have interfered with certain networks or systems of various types.
Okay. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Ahmed. I'm not a student here, but I actually went to UMBC a couple years ago where Dr. Forno teaches. Traditionally, I actually studied political science and then made my way into cybersecurity. And I work for a threat intelligence firm in Virginia. But about a year ago, I read an article on Lawfare, if anyone's familiar with that online publication. It's called Developing Loud Cyber Weapons. And it posed a really interesting question that I often think about, where it sort of pointed out, in discussing attribution and deterrence, it stated fighter planes and cruise missiles often bear U.S. insignias, and soldiers wear U.S. uniforms, but bullets do not. So in this day and age, do you think that sort of cyber weapons should be more like soldiers and planes, or unmarked like bullets? And if you think the analogy is ill-fitting, that's fine too. I'm just curious.
Who wants to take that? Go ahead.
I'll
Rick.
start. I think the analogy might work, but that's one that falls into that realm of trying to apply the analog world into the digital world. I mean, there's a lot of talk about cyber deterrence, applying the Cold War model of deterrence in cyberspace, and we agree not to do certain cyber attacks, just like we agree not to launch nuclear weapons at each other. It may not work that way. I don't think you can tag a digital packet on the internet as US only or whatever. You can make it look like it came from someplace else, as we've been talking about up here, but that's about as close as you can get to sort of deniability of these tools.
I think for the Stuxnet thing, for example, although it's widely believed that the U.S. and probably Israel were involved with that, they have never admitted to it. So that's an unnamed bullet, and probably if it was named, that would be serious trouble, because then the rest of the world it would be very arguably a declaration of war to have taken down their nuclear centrifuge.
Yeah, I think my summary response is you can create firewalls, just like you have personal firewalls, let's say on your own network or even at a corporate level. At a nation state level or equivalent, you start interfering with but not just national commerce, but international commerce. People sometimes don't, I don't think still, even to this day, fully appreciate just how incredibly dependent we are on the World Wide Web for just about everything now.
Over here?
Hi, I'm Darcy. I'm a student, not here. But to build off of the cyber warfare issue, we have alliances like NATO and agreements for more traditional military attacks that our allies will support us. But what role do our allies play in cyber warfare? Or because it's so ambiguous, do they play any? Thank you.
And why don't we have a NATO agreement for cyber? Just to add on to that.
Well, we do. I mean, NATO's taken an active approach to cyber. There's a manual that they've worked out. I think it's in its second or third iteration now, the Taliban manual that kind of outlines NATO's collective doctrine on cyber, how they would respond as an entity. There is partnerships between allies all the time. I mean, Mike alluded to it with the alleged reports that it was the US and Israel creating Stuxnet. So there is a lot of clandestine collaboration that goes on in cyber, because a lot of this is classified, particularly on the offensive side, for better or worse. So there is collaboration. Where we do run into some of the issues is the use of cyber tools in warfare, or even using networks in warfare. Several years ago, when we were launching drone strikes overseas, I forget where it was, the Germans complained loudly that our control centers in Germany could not be used to control drone strikes from their territory, and that when we were back here with our control centers to fly these drones around the world, the networks in Germany, we had to physically route the control signals around Germany's sovereign border in cyberspace because the Germans have wanted no part to do with it.
Well, this was the armed drones that were
Yes,
killing people on the
right,
ground.
right.
And they, yeah.
But just to kind of
Yeah.
illustrate the point about how, there's partnerships that work, and then sometimes the allies may not want to work together on issues of security that may involve cyber.
I think the attribution question also makes things clandestine, because when you can't be 100% sure that it was A or B and you don't want it to become public, you can, under the covers, probe A or B with your allies to see, and things can stay hidden.
Over here?
Hi, I'm Rich Wilson. My cyber aggression class is sitting back here in the last two rows here at MICA. They're sitting right
This
here.
is
Some of
cyber
the-
aggression class?
Cyber aggression is the name of the class, right? So with the background of the attribution and the cyber offense and cyber defense, I have a very basic question. To what degree do you think that our government's paralyzed because of technological illiteracy by the members of our government?
Members of our government is a large category.
Do you mean elected officials or anybody?
I think elected officials certainly are fairly techno-clueless. They didn't grow up with the technology. They don't really understand its full potential. Because they don't understand this new stuff, they tend to be fearful of it, just like anybody would be. This is something new. I don't understand it. Therefore, it's unknown. I'm afraid. And that tends to filter down into some of the technology policy decisions, unrelated to cyber, but just how we use the internet, copyright, things like that, digital rights, privacy online. I think, to overcome that, it's going to require a generational shift where folks who get it, whether they're older or middle-aged and certainly younger, move into the ranks of politicians. Then we might see some different views and more rationally informed views informing policy.
Tom, have you ever had a personal experience that would illustrate that point when you were talking perhaps with a member of Congress or a staff person and they just had no clue what you were saying?
Quite often, even.
It's
very challenging, especially with a politician.
Mm-hmm.
And though this is so much a part of society, and has been for quite some time. I mean, it's been going on 25 years now, at least, right? And it actually preceded that. But even in terms of just sort of the public perception and awareness was really the early 90s. And yeah, it's extremely challenging. There are some who have a clue and even have cyber clues, okay? But others are clueless or less focus because they'll leave it up to staffers. And so now they're extremely dependent, which means they're also susceptible to extraordinary influence by various actors. And some who have the best of intentions in mind, and others, perhaps they don't. There's a lot of people, I mean, I try not to be too cynical here about our own government, but there's a lot of people that are selling their wares. And we have failure after failure after failure, breach after breach after breach. We have we have cyber weapons, clearly cyber weapons, cyber tools that have been leaking like a sieve out of even NSA, and it doesn't seem to be any stopping it, right? I mean, where's that responsibility? I mean, and so, oh, well, it happened, right? All right, okay, OPM got breached. Oh, well, it happened. You know, it's just the day and age we live in. Without really thinking, what are the strategic consequences, you know, downstream, and what does it mean for society? And so these are questions. They're hard questions. Why do I want to spend, you know, 2 hours of my precious time with somebody who may actually have a clue when I could be spending those 2 hours, you know, because I've got to consider the next election and I need money to run that election. There's other drivers here, and then you have the famous Q bono. Who does it benefit, right? So you have to find that connection. And this is where, you know, there's some of us, and from the activist side, who attempt to find ways, in some cases informal groups, sometimes it's more formal, to find ways to raise these issues, because ultimately these do translate into policy and law.
Yep.
To add, very briefly add to this, two quick examples. When you have a senator in charge of a subcommittee writing legislation about the internet who has never sent an email.
Is that true?
I'm not saying who it was.
That's my example is someone who's basically has staffers that send emails. They do never send emails.
Right. That should be very, very telling, if not scary. And then if you want to have a good laugh, Google Senator Ted Stevens and the Internet of Tubes.
Oh, yeah.
And this became a meme, and it was him trying to understand Netflix and streaming video and whatnot, and he equated it to the internet being a series of tubes. And it took 3 days for his internet from his staffer to reach him. Read it, listen to it, try not to laugh too hard when you read it, but this goes to show you the level of competence, quite frankly, that some of these people have, and they're the ones that are writing the policy governing our use of these things.
Over here.
Good evening, my name is Kevin. Given all the problems that you described with commercial software and its licenses, why is it so difficult to convince people to try open source software, operating systems, and software?
Can you define those two?
Good question.
Source?
Okay, so what I was talking about was commercial companies that sell you software, and you click a license agreement, and so they pay their developers and teams and so on to build it, and you pay them to license the software. There's also software that's developed that's free of charge, so-called open source software, free software. How many people have heard of Linux? Raise your hands. Right, so Linux is an open source free operating system that's meant to be a substitute for Windows or the Mac operating system. And it's been around for a long time. It's been around for several decades now. And so you can get that. And in fact, a lot of companies use Linux because it actually works really well. And they use it to power their servers and their services. So the question is open source software better? Or why aren't people using it given the problems? I mean, I can think of two reasons. One is it's not better. It's also as is. You are also agreeing, if you read the license in the source code for the software that you download, it's exactly the same thing. It's exactly used as is. So if Linux, burns down your house, sorry, that you shouldn't have connected it to your fire, your sprinkler system or whatever that caused this to happen. And a good example of this actually is how many people have heard of the heartbleed bug? Have you heard of this? Have you seen the meme with the heart shaped? So heartbleed was a software bug. This term means a flaw in software. And the flaw was such that a bad actor could be very clever in how it interacted with the software that was running this heartbleed vulnerable stuff. and it could steal information from it. And it was so egregious that basically almost every site on the internet was running this software. So everyone was affected in some way. And this was open source software. The theory is that open source software means that everyone can look at it. It's not just the company that is building it and can see it. Absolutely anyone can vet it. And people had, but they still missed this problem. So anyway, that's part one of my answer. Part two of my answer is that people don't use it because it's hard to use. So even if it were more secure, you don't buy things because they're secure. If you want it to be really secure, you just would never use software at all, right? So clearly the functionality of the software matters. I don't use the Open Office is an open source substitute for Microsoft Office because it's terrible. It's better than it used to be. It's really hard to use. It might be more secure, but even if it's free, you might be willing to pay for something that's easier to use because ultimately you want to get your job done. So I think that those are two countervailing forces, and this is why I think that there needs to be legal policy action if you're going to solve this problem, because we shouldn't have to be picking security versus functionality, right? Why should we have to do that? We should be focused on functionality, and someone should be making sure that the software is up to code, that it's up to the best possible standards.
Tom?
Now, it's not like I saw these simpler days, the bygone era, the days of old, you know, and some of this is software lore in terms of history. But having been in Silicon Valley and worked with a lot of the people, having been at Park and spent a whole day, was an extraordinary day, the Palo Alto Research Center. There was a time, and there are still companies, there are companies, both closed and opens, that produce really, really high quality software and systems. There was a phrase that was used by someone who used to program one of the senior programmers in the early days of Apple. He called it talcum powder programming. Talcum powder. Mm-hmm. And that term was used because this goes back to some of the Mac Paint and McDraw. There's people who have gone back and have, even knowing the code, who have tried to break it. But it was designed in such a way to be incredibly stable. It was designed in such a way that you couldn't really crash it. But it was a simpler time. It was a simpler era. Machines tend to be more standalone, or if they were hooked up at all, it was very local. We now do have this whole extraordinary set of tubes, okay, that make up the internet. And the tubes are like endless. I mean, there's so many of them. It's like, you know, and you don't even know which one you're going down, you know, and where it's going through, right? And you got someone at the other end is, you know, putting water in it, right, or some other liquid. So it's like, wow, you know, what does this all mean? So this is a fundamental question. I have this mean that somehow open source, this sort of, the analogy I use, speaking of the analogy, is it's like you have access to a real library. I'm not talking digital libraries. I'm talking about the real library. Does MICA have a real library still? Can you actually go and get a book off a shelf? This is sort of like the open source. It's somehow because I can go to a library and take it off. And there are what they call libraries in software, right? There are actually libraries of software. Just because it's available, just because I can go and take it off a shelf, does not mean that it's readable. It doesn't mean that it actually is of use. And it certainly doesn't mean that it's secure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we are almost out of time, and we're going to have one more question, and then we're going to stick around and answer more questions in a more informal way, an environment out there. So you are the final questioner.
Thank you. My name is Andy. I do IT security at Dr. Forno's institution. And we make it as boring as we humanly can.
Boring code's the best
That's a
code.
goal.
Yes.
Boring
yes.
code.
We hunt down Social Security numbers a lot of the time just to stamp them out. I have noticed working there for many years that there are different attitudes which have to be overcome. There is a broad academic attitude that all information should be open. And there is an attitude I often get from students. Most of the students we hire to work with us are computer science or information systems majors, that it should be all about computers. And I have to work very hard to get them to understand that very little of it is about computers these days. It's about manipulating people. And it's about understanding that there are lots of bad people out there who will go to extraordinary lengths to get someone to do what they want. I keep a copy of Machiavelli's The Prince on my desk to read to them sometimes. I am always amazed at how stunned they are that there are bad people working very hard to be bad out there. This seems to be a cultural problem. I don't know if it's specific to people who get into the computer business and just don't think much about bad people. But have you run into this kind of attitude problem elsewhere?
Should people have Machiavelli on their desk? That is very interesting.
Sure, I'm all for reading books, physical old books that actually have pages in them that you own, which is great. I think academia is a unique environment because you're right. Academia tends to be very open and tolerating, but for folks like you that are charged with information systems protection, okay, you've got to balance that spirit of openness and collaboration with the very real needs that, gee, we could be a target or used as a stepping off point for another attack by somebody else. Absolutely. So there is a cultural balance in academia, but also I think in most large organizations, maybe not DoD, some of these, the really classified elements like NSA, where they've got the whole classified model going, but to be able to strike that balance where there's the ability to do your business in that environment, like what Mike was saying earlier, you have to draw that line somewhere. BYOD, bring your own device. That policy 10 years ago, you would never have allowed that to happen. Times changed, society changed. Now we're seeing BYOD as a matter of corporate policy. You can bring your tablet into your workplace and use it because the company saves money. I just read the other day that the Department of Defense is loosening its rules on bringing mobile phones into classified environments. Not the really highly secure environments, but it used to be you had to leave your mobile phone outside the room before you went into the meeting. Now they're letting people, based on certain waivers and permissions, bring their phones in to these rooms. That was unheard of 10 years ago. The culture is shifting, and policy and law and process does tend to lag these cultural shifts.
So have you ever written an invitation that said BYOD? But do you see a cultural difference between a younger generation and your own generation in terms of what they expect to be doing in the cyber?
We talked about it before with Facebook, right? So academia is open, but all of society is open. We're all sharing all of this stuff. I have this feeling that it's an out of sight, out of mind kind of problem. So one way when I first got onto Facebook, I saw that some of my younger, like my wife's niece, had like 750 Facebook friends, something like this. And I just thought, I bet you made friends with people that you met yesterday and will never talk to again, but you made Facebook friends with them. But when you write posts, you're not thinking about those people. You're thinking about your close friends. And what you really ought to be thinking is there's an auditorium of 1,000 people sitting in front of you that when you show this picture of yourself drunk at a party, all 1,000 people in that auditorium saw it. And if you're unlucky and someone was looking over one of those people's shoulder while that person was surfing your site, they saw it too. They noticed it was you, right? It's much more than you think when you're just typing this stuff on a computer keyboard. And so I think this sort of lack of imagination of what could go wrong and what are the incentives for someone to make the wrong thing happen, to steal that information, to do that phishing attack, to exploit your software, to break into Equifax and steal all of this data that on all of us and to use it against us for money. You have to have a bit of imagination beyond yourself and think of the incentives of other people to get past those defenses.
How did that go over with your niece?
I think she felt a little bit sheepish after I said that, and then just kept, she didn't unfriend 300 people. She just kept on doing what she was doing.
So I'm going to ask Tom the very, very last question. We didn't bring up the idea of bots in here and how much bots are manipulating the social media environment. So bots are automated. You want to explain what a bot is?
Well, they're automated agents, that you program to do certain things. It's not the actual person. You'd be launched by a person.
So it looks like a person
It
is
can,
liking you or?
and there was and I want to come back to the cultural thing, because I think
Okay.
it's really, it's actually the tie into one of the words in the title of this inaugural Great Talk that we haven't actually, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. But the bot thing, there was a group of people did a study on how many Twitter accounts were actually real people. And it turns out there's umpteen hundreds and hundreds of thousands of those accounts that are not real people.
Maybe as much as 40% in some
That's
cases.
a
Of the whole Twitter universe.
So, and if they're generating social media, right, and propagating it as if it's real, right, this whole fake news or what's real and what isn't. But it does come back to the human factors. It comes back to the human condition. And one of the words in this inaugural Great Talk is spies. And having worked in a very secure environment, having spent many years in the shadows, some said, spying is sort of the world's at least second oldest profession. And this power to know something about somebody else is extraordinarily heady. And in today's age, there's just extraordinary, this human condition is rearing its head again. It's like, I want to know as much as there is to know about everybody else. And so we were living almost as kind of this strangely, normalized, vicarious world in which we get to see so much of what else. We got the president himself, who apparently early in the morning when he gets up or has his constitutional, decides to start tweeting out to all of us, right? And you see thousands upon thousands of people following it and commenting on it. I mean, it's just, for me, from the cultural perspective, it's just a fascinating, this juxtaposition of all of these. But it comes back to who we are. After all, we are carbon-based units. We have an analog brain, right? We're not bots, and we're not made up of zeros and ones, right? So, unless you believe in the Matrix. No, so, you never know, right?
And selfies are kind of like self-surveillance.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, self-surveillance. So we live in an interesting world, as the Chinese would say. It's always interesting times, no matter which time you're in.
All right. Well, that wraps it up, although not really. So we'll meet you out there, and thank you very much.
I wanted to thank you very much for joining us today. It was a wonderful program, and Great Talks is really honored to have you start out our program. And I want to thank all of you, too, for joining us. It's been very exciting, and I would like to invite you inside. We'll have questions and answers inside. We have refreshments, and I look forward to seeing you, and tell your friends about our upcoming programs in the future. Thank you very much.